Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. I'm so excited to be here with you all. And today I'm going to be talking about my experiences as someone who has lived with OCD for a majority of their life and is now in a completely different place due to amazing treatments like ERP. And I'm in such a different place because of it. And I'm at the point in my recovery where I love to share my experiences and hopefully provide people with some hope amidst all the darkness that OCD can cast into one's life. So, first off, I'm going to come and introduce myself. My name is Kathryn. I am a 20-year-old OCD advocate from San Francisco, California. I am a college student. I'm going to be starting my third year of college, my junior year of college, and I'm studying clinical counseling psychology. And I hope to someday become a clinical social worker. And I've lived with OCD for a majority of my life. I started showing signs and symptoms of OCD from a really young age, probably around 4 or 5. And that led me to just be a really anxious child throughout my life. And I was really fortunate to be diagnosed pretty early on. I was diagnosed at age 12. And around the age of 13, 14, I started doing ERP. And I did a majority of intensive ERP throughout my high school career, which eventually led me to be able to be successful in college. And here I am going on to my third year. Um, and so today, I just want to preface this by saying that in no way am I a professional. I am someone with lived experience with OCD. And for me, a lot of what really helped me get through my OCD recovery and really, you know, fight back against this debilitating disorder was really learning about it and understanding it helped me to take a more logical approach to dealing with the disorder. And a lot of what I'll be sharing, my wisdoms or insights, all come from my own experience and things that I've learned from professionals and clinicians. So, in no way am I going to be providing clinical advice, but I can answer it from the perspective of someone who has lived experience with this disorder and is on the other side. Okay, so kind of the approach that I try to take with the questions is answer the ones that I think I can probably answer the best, and also the ones that can generalize to the biggest group of individuals, just because I'm like, oh, if this question is a broader question, it'll probably apply to more people. Let's see. It's interesting. I'm looking at these questions, and a lot of them seem to be about OCD latching onto things. And all of us know that OCD will cling on to the things that mean the most to us and will attach meaning to so many different things in our lives. And it can be really distressing, especially if it's something that we care a lot about or that hits really close to home, whether it be our family, a significant other, children, whatever it may be. So let's see. Um, this question. How do you maintain motivation even as OCD relentlessly searches for things to latch onto? I find that this has been happening over the last week and I'm reaching a breaking point. So, I think the thing about OCD, which is really important to acknowledge, is that your OCD is going to try to stay alive regardless of how much progress you're making in your recovery. So, even if you're at the point where you're doing really, really well, where you're doing your exposures, where you're conquering so many of your fears and you're making significant progress, even at that, your OCD is going to try to find something to cling on to so that it still serves as has a place of importance in your life. And so, even though it'll feel like it's just grasping onto strings or thin air, that's just a part of OCD, and I understand how horrible it can be. It can be so, so frustrating too, because I found, at least for myself, where I would be at a point where I was doing really, really well. And it was just so frustrating because all these things that I felt weren't necessarily issues for me prior, it felt that my OCD started developing all these new themes and obsessions, regardless of them being totally non existent for a majority of the time that I was struggling. And I think that the biggest thing, and this is something that I could talk about for so, so long, is just using values as, I guess, a platform, as a leverage in your recovery. And I think that this can be really difficult, but I think the whole idea is looking at why you're doing what you're doing in your recovery, and just having, I guess, a better perspective on why you're doing what you're doing. Because with exposures, I mean, we all know this, exposures can be so, so anxiety provoking. I mean, that's the point of it. And I think amidst all this anxiety provoking things that you're putting yourself through, and how you don't necessarily, you won't see that progress overnight. It's not immediate. It takes time for you to actually see those changes come into reality. um, I think that for me, it just was really trying to find reasoning of why I'm doing what I'm doing. What is my OCD taking away from me in my life? What is my OCD preventing me from doing? And why is my OCD, why is recovery something that is important to me? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And so for so many individuals, it's looking at all that OCD took away from you. And that's at least what I used, all the things that my OCD was preventing me from doing that I really wanted to be able to do again, things that I hoped for myself, goals that I wanted to achieve, dreams that I had for myself. I use those as motivating factors in my recovery. And I looked at whatever it may be, why I'm going to tackle a really, really hard exposure, because I eventually want to get to this point. So for me, um, because my OCD attacked, my main theme was perfectionism OCD. So struggling with perfectionistic tendencies, obsessions, compulsions, revolving around school and my schoolwork. And it made it to the point where I couldn't really even do school anymore, just because I was so debilitated by all the impact and influence that my OCD was having on my life and my ability to be a student. So for me, at least, I looked at, I mean, and looking at it from a values standpoint and just kind of the nature of OCD, OCD will latch on to anything that's of any importance or value to you. So for me, it was school. My education was something that I always cared a lot about, was something that's important to me. I think learning is, at least personally, I think it's a lifelong process, and it's something that I care really, really deeply about. And so naturally, my OCD latched onto it, and that became kind of my main obsessions and compulsions all surrounded that, which prevented me from actually being able to do any sort of education, learning, and prevented me from being able to go to high school for so long. And I think that for me, I wanted to return to school. I wanted to be able to do school. I wanted to graduate high school and go on to higher education. And that really served as like my motivation for being able, because I knew that if I didn't do my exposures, I wouldn't be able to finish high school. I wouldn't be able to go back to being at school with my peers, my friends. I wouldn't be able to go to college, which, because I did all my exposures, because I got to such an amazing place in my OCD recovery journey, I'm entering my third year of college, and I've been really, really successful in my studies at college. And that's all because of my exposures, and that kind of served as a guiding force for me amidst all that. But I know that, especially just going back to the question itself, when OCD will just have points where it's just heightened significantly, and it feels like it's just coming on really, really hard. And it makes so much sense that that would then feel like a breaking point and just wanting to give up. But I think the biggest thing is it will get better. And I know that it's so hard to even envision getting to that point because in those really dark, hard moments, it feels like it won't get better in the slightest just because it's hard to even see through all the damage and destruction that OCD is leaving and doing in your life, but it will get better. And I think for me, yeah, the biggest thing was just really um, finding and those values and things that I wanted to achieve. And I really set specific goals for myself. So I had things that were short term, long term things that I wanted to be able to do. And I think that helped me stay motivated in my recovery. And I think also, going back to the whole idea of also surrounding yourself with people in your life who are going to be there. I know that's something that not everyone is lucky enough to have, but finding those people, even if it's just one person who can be there to support you, who can be there just so you can talk to during those really rough days. I know the one really great thing about No CD is they have free support groups. So joining one of those, I know it can be so encouraging to surround yourself with people who really understand your experiences and who aren't just understand seeing the pain that you're going through, but understand it because they're going through it themselves also. um, I know I've mentioned this before and talked about it, but for me, one thing that was really valuable was when I went to residential treatment. When I was 15, that was the first time I'd ever met people with OCD other than myself. And that was such a life changing experience for me because I felt so much less alone in my struggles because OCD itself can be so incredibly isolating. And I thought that I was the only one who was experiencing these things. I thought OCD can only look one way, the way that it looked for me. But then once I started to realize how multifaceted it was, how many people also are struggling with the exact same things I was struggling with, who are who are battling their brains on a daily basis. It felt really obviously you don't want to see anyone experiencing the pain that you're experiencing, but when you also are able to connect with individuals and feel less alone, that's like such an incredible feeling. So I'd say try to make those connections with individuals with OCD, and there's so many great ways to do so online here with No CD. And I would really try to take advantage of that because they're going to be there for you on your hardest days and truly know what that feels like. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. I know this question was also asked up above. Is it normal for OCD to latch onto what if her values are changing, combined with meta OCD and backdoor spike every time it convinces me I like and want my content to be true, despite it being the opposite? So, like I said, OCD will try to have the power regardless of being um, regardless of where you're at in your recovery, OCD will try to latch on to everything and anything to keep that power, to keep um, its its prominence in your life, and will try to do anything to keep that. So OCD will try to convince you that your values are changing. That will try to convince you that that you are that your values, your new values, are in alignment with the content of your intrusive thoughts, of your OCD. And that can be so distressing. But I think just really recognizing that it's OCD, regardless of what it's throwing at you, and that, and I know that can be really, really challenging too, especially when you're trying to use your values as a guiding force in your recovery, something that's going to help you, and also not being sure of what your values are. Um, so I think even at that, just really trying to recognize yourself apart from your OCD can be really valuable. I know for me, for so long, I kind of, especially when my OCD was um, really, really severe, I felt like I couldn't distinguish myself apart from everything that I was experiencing because it felt like that was who I was. It felt like that was my entire identity was OCD. Um, but I think really trying to understand, and even in a moment when your OCD isn't spiked, just really trying to um, I would say just really trying to, whether it be writing it out, this is what I really value. This is what's helping me in my recovery. And even though you're not going to want to ruminate over what your OCD is saying, it's also still important to try to still understand who you are throughout your recovery. Obviously, not giving into your OCD in the way of being like giving yourself reassurance, trying to um, seek certainty in every single aspect of your values. But I think if that is something that your OCD specifically targets, maybe even a values approach wouldn't even be the best um, thing for you in your recovery. Maybe it could just be goals that are guiding you. But I think also one thing that really helped me is understanding that the more that I progressed in my recovery, the more I would start to understand myself more and see myself apart from my OCD. So there were a lot of things, especially for me, my OCD surrounds perfectionism, school. There were so many things I convinced myself were what I wanted, what I believed in, when really it was all my OCD. And that can be really, really distressing because especially your values, if they're things that you really hold true to yourself and your OCD makes you second guess what those are and makes you doubt them constantly, that can be really, really distressing. And I think that kind of ties into the debilitating nature of OCD and why it has such an impact on individuals. But I thought so many things were my values when really they were OCD's values. And it can be so, so confusing. But I think just providing you with some hope down the line that it does get better, and that the more that you make progress in your recovery, the more you do your exposures, the more you are really combating and facing your OCD head on, the more it's going to be easier to distinguish those values and they're going to become less fuzzy. And I think just knowing that a OCD can latch onto absolutely anything. It's not just, even if there are certain themes that are talked about heavily, and you see them all over, whether it be online, in books, in podcasts about OCD, even if your theme isn't necessarily talked about, I don't want to provide anyone with necessarily reassurance, but OCD can latch onto absolutely anything, and there's nothing that OCD necessarily stays away from. Um, and it can really be anything that holds any value to your in your life. And I think also looking at it when it's combined with meta OCD, that can be especially distressing. So, meta OCD being, what if I actually don't have OCD? What if this is just something like OCD about having OCD, about your diagnosis, about what you're experiencing, and if it's actually not it? And that can be so confusing, especially amidst it all, because at least for so many people, it's like, oh, well, at least I know my OCD diagnosis is the reason behind this. But then when your OCD starts targeting your OCD diagnosis and whether it's actually valid, whether you're just faking it for attention, all these different thoughts, that can make it even more debilitating. Let's see. Um, Sorry, I'm a little stuffed up too. So if you hear me like sniffling a little, it's because of that. Let's see. Okay. Does anyone have tips for compulsions that happen so quickly slash automatically that they are hard to stop slash avoid in time? Um, so I think the biggest thing I've talked about this a lot in previous Q&A sessions, previous lives. For me, one of the biggest things that really helped me make a lot of progress in my recovery was just gaining that level of awareness of when these things were happening. Um, uh, I think for me, just really knowing when I was experiencing a compulsion. And especially if these things are somewhat automatic and are really hard to anticipate, I think that the more awareness that you gain over what's happening, so just knowing what types of situations trigger these compulsions, what types of obsessions trigger them. Um, I know for me, one thing that was really helpful, obviously, any of these things for anyone could become a potential compulsion or obsession in itself. So I just want to preface it by saying that, but just kind of keeping notes for yourself, whether it just be keeping a little notebook, tallying how many times these things are happening to you. And the more that you are aware of when it's happening, the easier it's going to be to eventually combat it. So a lot of times, I know for me at least, I'm always tying it back to my personal experience just because that's what I'm most comfortable talking about, especially since I'm not a professional. But knowing that for me, when I started to really become more aware of when I was really engaging in these compulsions, what types of situations were provoking it, it was easier for me to become a lot more aware and eventually resist these compulsions and really start to understand what was happening in the situation that was making it feel like that was the only resort or option. And so I think that even though these compulsions, especially whether it be ones that just feel so automatic and just uncontrollable, the more awareness that you have over them and the more awareness you have in the situation, the easier it's going to be to eventually combat them and target it in ERP work. And I think even if it feels like you're not necessarily making immediate progress right away, just really understanding it better and understanding your OCD better can make all the difference in your recovery. And even though sometimes it can be like, oh, this is a waste of time, I'm not necessarily making progress in the way that I want to. Having a more strategic approach can be really, really valuable and can help you down the line. Because I know for so long I really didn't understand my OCD and just what it kind of surrounded and just what potentially triggered my obsessions and my compulsions, what types of situations were especially difficult for me, what types of situations made my OCD especially loud. And really understanding that helped me to understand what I needed to focus on in therapy and ERP work. And I'm just going to continue. I see some of these other, um, let's see, this person had some other questions. So I'll just answer a few of those. Also, how do you tell the difference between perfectionism with school OCD versus GAD, generalized anxiety disorder? Since people often say that GAD involves real life situations like work, school, etc. So I think the biggest thing is I know there is a lot of overlap between OCD and anxiety disorders themselves, and there's a lot of ways that they can look really, really similar. But for me, I think the biggest indicator that something was OCD, perfectionism OCD, um, versus generalized anxiety disorder, which I'm also diagnosed with, for me was really understanding the OCD cycle of it all. So just knowing that it starts out with an obsession, and then you have the anxiety, the distress, and knowing that you want to eliminate that anxiety in some sort of way. So you then perform a compulsion, which someone with OCD thinks will reduce that anxiety or distress that the thought is causing. And then you'll get that temporary relief. And because the relief that the compulsion provides is only temporary, is only short term, it's just going to eventually you're gonna have another obsession, another intrusive thought, and the cycle is going to be continuous. So just really trying to understand what's going on, I think it can be really difficult to differentiate, especially with something that's so involving real life situations. But I think also it can be really valuable to seek out um, the opinions of a clinician, someone who specializes in OCD, because only you would understand your OCD best. And they oftentimes, if they really understand your specific situation, can have great input on that. But just knowing that the difference between anxiety and other or anxiety disorders versus OCD is that OCD has the obsessions and the compulsions versus, I mean, it still has the anxiety nonetheless, but it also is a cycle and that it will keep on repeating and repeating unless it's intentionally broken. I know that that probably wasn't the most clear response, but it's still, it can be really difficult. And I think it is really dependent on a case by case basis, but would be something that if you do have the resources to access or already have an OCD therapist, an OCD specialist, that can be a really valuable person to seek out. Their opinion on that. And obviously, you would know your case better than anyone. And I think that can be really difficult, is just knowing that even at the end of the day, you're going to understand your situation best. And that even though someone can give you advice in a situation, only you will truly know what you're experiencing. And I know that it can be challenging amidst the fact that OCD can really, in a sense, taint reality and what you're experiencing and can distort what feels like is the truth of the matter or the situation. So that's when seeking out professional advice and guidance can be especially valuable. Um, as a third year college student as well, how did you manage to survive slash make it through college with your mental health intact? Helpful tips. So I think that for me, the biggest thing was, for me at least, what was really helpful was really trying to stay on top of my OCD recovery and compulsions despite the workload and despite everything that I was dealing with. So, really carving out time for my own recovery and what I was experiencing. And I think really dedicating time to that still. And I think um, just really knowing that at the end of the day, you are the most important. And I know that can be really difficult, especially for me with perfectionism OCD. That made it really, really challenging at times because I'm like, well, no, I need to prioritize an essay that I have, um, something that I'm, a work assignment or whatever it may be. And just knowing that at the end of the day, my recovery is what I need to prioritize. Although school is so, so important, I can't be successful unless I dedicate time to working on my recovery and myself and really doing the work that is necessary. Um, I think also is just knowing that um, not taking on too much, which, at least with my OCD and the nature of it, with perfectionism OCD, I found myself wanting to take on a lot more than I could chew and what would actually be sustainable. Um, for me, so wanting to take on a bunch of other obligations aside from classes. And I think even in the beginning, for me, one thing that my therapist and I kind of made sure to be intentional about was just my workload. So when I started college in the fall of 2020. I decided for my first semester to take a reduced course load, which I think was really, really beneficial. Just because I know, especially for me, and I know for so many other people, OCD can really ramp up amidst those life changes, amidst different big events in your life. And so for me, that was moving away to college. Living on my own, having all that extra independence that I hadn't experienced before. And I think that for me, really knowing that in this situation, what was going to be the best for me would be taking fewer classes than a lot of my other peers. And I think in those situations, it can be really challenging um, not to. Not to compare yourself to other people and their experiences. Well, so and so is doing this, this, and this. Well, I'm only doing this. I need to get on their level. I need to be doing the same thing. But just knowing that aside from being a college student, you're also dealing with OCD, which is so, so, so excruciatingly hard, and it's not an easy thing to deal with. So just giving yourself some lenience and some compassion amidst all that you're dealing with, and knowing that you just need to be trying your best, and that is good enough. Also, having a really great therapist slash OCD specialist really made the difference. I know that for me, especially during times when I was really struggling with my OCD or other comorbid conditions. I also struggle from depression and other anxiety disorders, as well as ADHD. And for me, it was really helpful to have that person that I could constantly rely on and be my rock, especially a clinical rock in the sense that they really understood OCD and could really help me set limits. And even just being very proactive can be really helpful in so many situations, whether you're in college, whether it's in a work environment, a job environment, whatever it may be. Being proactive can be really helpful in OCD recovery and really setting limits for yourself. Let's see. I'm going to go back to some of the previous questions just so I can answer some of those. Let's see. My ROCD is kicking my butt. Nothing is wrong, but I can't stop associating my wife with all these negative thoughts. I realistically know they are not true, but this little gremlin in my head won't stop. That sounds like OCD. OCD is brutal. First and foremost, everyone who has OCD and battles it and is dealing with it is people with OCD are some of the strongest people I've ever met, just because there is nothing like OCD. And it's so, so, so challenging, and something that um, you truly have to be resilient to deal with. And I think that's one of the most challenging things about OCD, regardless of the theme, whether it be relationship OCD in this situation, perfectionism OCD, contamination OCD, harm OCD, sexual orientation OCD, whatever it may be. The biggest thing, or the hardest thing, at least for me, was I know that I had my logical brain, the side of my understanding of things that were logical, that were grounded in reality, that I knew to be true 100%. But then with OCD, I felt that I always had an OCD brain. So part of myself that was always kind of tainted in OCD. That was something that, even though I knew something wasn't true, OCD would always make me second guess it, and it feels so, so real and so, so distressing. And I think that's the biggest thing that keeps OCD in power, is all the distress that it causes and how real it can be. But I think one of the things that I always reminded myself of, obviously not in um, reassurance way. Um, but just knowing that um, the the fear is real, the threat is not. So in these situations, although it may feel that the threat of the situation is especially prevalent as something that you should be afraid of, it's likely not true. It's not real at all, but that doesn't mean that what you're feeling in the situation isn't real. And I think that's what can be so, so scary is the feelings are so, 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 so real. And that's what makes it so confusing because you're like, oh, if I'm in this situation, um, if in this situation, um, something I feel like if this was a real threat, I would be feeling this way. So I think that can make it so confusing is just understanding that wait, this isn't actually happening. This is something that is just due to OCD, but I'm still feeling these feelings. So just being able to separate the two can be something that is really important. But just knowing at the end of the day, things are just OCD, um, regardless of how challenging that can be. And I know that's so much easier said than done. Just acknowledging it, sitting with the uncertainty of these thoughts, and but it can be such a pain and so so awful. But just keep doing what you're doing and just going through it, and eventually OCD will quiet down. The less power that you give it, the less of an impact it's going to eventually have on your life. Let's see. Let's see. Can I do ERP on my own using the app? I think this is a really great question. One big thing that I want to preface is that I know that for so many individuals, seeking OCD treatment, ERP, having a therapist can be incredibly inaccessible just due to financial, cultural, whatever it may be. Just knowing that it can be a really challenging situation to even be able to find a therapist. And I mean, the one really amazing thing about OCD is that they do make these services a lot more accessible than potentially a private practitioner. But I think that there are so many ways which are really wonderful, especially with the NoCD app and so many other incredible clinicians who have online platforms and really make it easier to really work through your OCD. I think there are also some really great workbooks I know out there. Um, I know Kimberly Quinlan has a really great OCD workbook. There's so many others I know as well. I know there's the Acton OCD workbook. So the acceptance commitment therapy alongside OCD. And that can be a really valuable resource for people to do ERP and work through their OCD independently. But it's definitely possible. I think the biggest thing that can be really valuable about having a therapist is just really they can kind of guide you through whatever whatever you're dealing with and helping you kind of understand where to start. But I think the biggest thing, knowing that the best way to do ERP is by breaking it up into smaller chunks. You're not just going to do something immediately that is so so anxiety provoking, but you're going to start with doing smaller things and then work your way up to something that's a lot more challenging. And by the time you get there, you'll feel a lot more equipped and prepared. But I think it's definitely possible. And there are so many great books, there are podcasts out there, the app. So I think you could definitely do it on your own and that it is something that you could do. But obviously, you would know your case the best and would be what would work for you. Let's see. I'm probably going to only answer a few more questions because I feel my voice kind of dying out a little bit and my nose is especially stuffy. So I'll probably do 3 more questions. Let's see. Having my first ERP session on Wednesday. Should I prepare in any way? Well, I first want to say good luck. Starting ERP is such an incredible step in going through recovery and getting to that point of conquering your OCD and being able to live your life, which is so awesome. I think they're just I don't really necessarily think you need to prepare in any way, but also going in with some expectations can be really helpful. For me, at least, I think the biggest thing is knowing that you're not going to see changes overnight. I think that that's something that's really hard not to go in with that expectation, just especially when you're doing things that are so anxiety provoking that you're purposefully putting yourself in these uncomfortable situations. It can be really challenging not to have that expectation. Oh, I did this really challenging thing. When I go to bed and wake up the next morning, I'm going to see all these changes. But just knowing that it's a process and that it's going to take time to see results. But also knowing that it's meant to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But working your way through it is what's going to get you better and what's going to help you. And I think that's when it can be really great to find other motivators to keep you going throughout the recovery process and journey. And I think that's when for me, really finding an OCD therapist, someone who I really connected with, made all the difference, because it felt like, aside from being my therapist, they were also my biggest cheerleader during the ERP and recovery journey, and someone who I could really rely on for that emotional support, as well as not just the guidance of what exposures would benefit me the most. But I think, yeah, just going in with the expectation that nothing's going to happen overnight, but also that doing ERP is probably one of the hardest things you'll ever have to do. I think just knowing that apart from ERP, and I talked about this on previous lives a few weeks ago with Julia, another OCD advocate, but just the fact that going through ERP and doing exposures in the therapy process, you can learn so much about yourself and gain so many different things that you can apply to so many other areas in your life, and you become so tenacious and resilient and in so many ways that you never would have expected. And I think just knowing that regardless of how challenging it is, it's going to be one of the most rewarding things you'll ever do, just because you're going to get your life back from OCD. And that's something that for so long I never thought was possible, but ERP makes that possible. So I just want to wish you the best of luck and that you can do this. Let's see. Let's see. I'm going to answer, I think, one more question. Can some exposures be more harmful than helpful? I have harm OCD and I'm a mother of 3 and deal with disturbing, intrusive images of harm. How do you do exposures when they are so scary? I think that can be so challenging. Just especially when these things hit so close to home, whether it be harm OCD specifically, targeting your children, your family. That can make it so scary. But I think this is the way that I always kind of like to frame it is I kind of like to compare kind of in an analogy sense, in a metaphorical sense, that OCD is or ERP is very similar to physical therapy in a way. It's kind of like physical therapy for the brain. You're stretching yourself. It's gonna hurt it's going to hurt for a while before it feels better. So in these situations, it's going to be really, really scary. It's going to feel impossible. You're going to be like, well, why am I increasing my anxiety when I just want it to go away, but it's going to hurt before it helps. And that's just a part of the process. And like physical, you're working a muscle, you're building a muscle, you're building that muscle of resiliency against OCD. And that's going to take time and it's going to hurt in the process. It's going to be scary in the process. But at the end, it's really going to make a difference. And just knowing that, with these, one really great way, especially with things that you feel like you can't necessarily, especially with intrusive thoughts that you really can't put into action or whatever, can be doing a worry script. So writing it out, writing out the situation, writing out the scariest possible thing, and reading it to yourself, reading it to other people. That can be really helpful, especially with thoughts that are like, oh, well, how would I actually do exposures on this without putting anyone at harm, without putting anyone at risk? So just really doing these imaginal exposures more so, and writing out these things, putting it into words, putting your thoughts into words, repeating them out loud. That can really be a great approach to exposures, with thoughts that feel especially scary and like you can't necessarily do, like the exposure surrounding it, like you would a contamination, OCD per se. But yeah, I think I'm going to end it on this note for today. I just wanted to say, keep fighting, everyone. I love coming on here and answering questions. I hope it helped in any way. And just really wanted to say that you're all doing an amazing job, regardless of where you are in your recovery. It does get to the point where it will get better, even though it feels like it won't. I know that for so long, I felt like my OCD wouldn't get better. I wouldn't make progress, but I'm at a place where I never thought I would be. And that's all because of ERP and just putting all my everything into treatment and recovery. And I know everyone can do it. And you're all so, so, so strong for being able to deal with this. I just wanted to wish you all a great night, and I will see you again very soon. Good night, everyone.